Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll give folks just a few more minutes to log on. Um, Thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with us for the first of three special guest lectures as part of the 21-day Equity Challenge presented by the University of Rochester Office of Equity and Inclusion in partnership with our good friends from the United Way and the Association of Minority Residents and Fellows, for whom we are so grateful for their partnership with us to put on this 21-day series that actually begins February 5th and continues through the 26th. But we have as our special guest today, again, the first of three lectures that are part of the 21-day Equity Challenge. We are so grateful to Shane Weigand for being with us today and joining us as part of this for being our guest lecturer. He is co-director of the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project at Coordinated Care Services. And today, Shane will explore the root causes of inequity in Greater Rochester, as well as stories of joy, resilience in the civil rights in Rochester's Black and Hispanic communities. Shane, we are so grateful to have you join us to share your time and your passion for topics surrounding equity and inclusion, but also the history of Rochester, which I think that so often, it's very easy to forget where we came from and how we got here. And so we're so grateful to you for helping us to remember. So I want to take no more time, Shane. The floor is yours. Welcome, and thank you so much.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Norma. I'm so excited to share with you some of the work that I've been learning. Everything I'm going to share today actually is stuff that I didn't know about my community that I've lived in pretty much my entire life here in Rochester. I didn't learn this in school. I wouldn't have learned this if it weren't for fourth graders in my classroom when I used to teach in Rush Henrietta. Some fourth graders wanted to know, had Martin Luther King Jr. come to Rochester? They wanted to know if we had had a civil rights movement in our community. And I realized I wanted to know this too. And so my students and I started researching. We started meeting elders like Dr. Walter Cooper, people like Nancy Padilla, people like Dr. Alice Holloway Young. And as we learned their stories, we realized that there were hundreds of everyday people in Rochester, Black, white, Hispanic, who worked together to build a more just and equitable place. And as we shared these stories outside of our classroom, I got to meet an incredible team of teachers, including Keisha James, who co-directs this project with me. Normally we do these together, but she's on vacation today and sends her best to all of you. And I'm excited to share with you, though, some of what our team at Anti-Racist Curriculum Project at CCSI has pulled together. We're going to try to make this a little bit interactive in the chat. There'll be a few times throughout that I'll invite people to share things they notice and wonder, or what feelings might be coming up, or questions. Feel free to put those in the chat, but I'll make it clear a few different times as we go. And what we're going to do with you is going to be somewhat similar to how we do this with kids. I'm going to share a lot of primary sources. Uh, I'm going to connect the dots with some of them, but ask you to draw your own conclusions and decide what these mean to each of you. Again, our work at the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project is really to empower and equip students, teachers, and community members like yourselves to explore and to own our local history, especially stories of resistance, from enslavement to civil rights, and inspire people to consider, what does it mean to get involved in my community and carry on this equity journey that all of you are on today. This is our leadership team. We're really grateful to be a part of. These are the elders and youth who also helped create the presentation and the curriculum work that we're going to share a little bit with you today. We do this in schools of ed, and all across the community, from the real estate board to U of R to United Way or wherever. Our mission is that everyone would have the chance to own and explore some of these local stories that many of us did not learn growing up. We're going to try to do everything today in a restorative way. We're going to try to do it from a position of inquiry, where I'm not going to tell you what to think or how to feel, but really invite you to notice, to wonder, to draw your own conclusions, and to take those conclusions towards civic action and carrying on the legacy that so many have before us of building a more equitable Greater Rochester. Our big question for today's session is going to be around these two. I want to ask you to try to get closer to answering, how has racism impacted Greater Rochester? How have people responded? How have people resisted? I want to invite you to think about, how does this history inform your own equity journey and our larger equity journey that we have to be on together? On the right is a photo of Dr. Walter Cooper in the 1950s with a group of Black, white, and Puerto Rican folks coming together to challenge redlining and housing discrimination in Rochester. We're going to learn a lot about this in a little bit. But I emphasize this picture at the beginning because it's a group of people across different backgrounds from different places in our community saying, we're not okay with what's happening. And together, we're going to do something. And together they did. And we're going to learn a lot about that and what it means for us moving forward. But I'm grateful for you all to take your lunch to dive into this. And I hope it's a great time. So here's what we got. I want to start off with having you just take a little bit of a peek at our community. This is an image, a map, clearly. I've purposely kind of taken off the key. And I want to invite you just to take a quick minute and think, what do I notice? What do I wonder about this image? If you're at your lunch, feel free to set down your sandwich. And I invite you to open up the chat. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds, and I'll tell us all to hit enter at the same time. But if you would, start typing, but don't hit enter. Anything you notice or wonder about this image. What patterns do you see? It could be as simple as I see a dot, or I see a line, or there's a word that you know. But again, maybe even put on your fourth grade brain here for a second. I want you to look at our community in a little bit different way. You have 30 seconds, open up your chat, start to type, but again, don't hit enter yet. And share anything you wonder or notice. Nothing's too small. About 20 more seconds. Keep typing, but don't hit enter. Anything you notice or wonder in this image. 10 more seconds. We're going to hit enter in 5, 4, 3, 2. Go ahead and hit enter. Let's see what people noticed. Oh, I love this. Folks talking about a concentration of colors closer to city proper, wanting to know, what do the dots represent? Why are we only on the east side? Seeing some roadways, they don't seem to be linear. Patterns of access to resources, maybe. Noticing a cluster of concentrated colors, some folks noticing above Fairport, kind of the speckly patch here. Pockets where the dots come together, a lot of blue, a yellow-green in the city area. Oh, these are some really great thinking. I'm loving all of this. More colors in the upper left corner, closer to Rochester. What's going on in the rural areas? Not everything is included. I love that, Susan. It's not. Let's give you a little bit more. Take a look right here. And this time you don't have to wait. Feel free just to throw it right in the chat. What do you notice and wonder now? A little bit more of our community. What's sticking out to folks? Any other patterns you're seeing? I'm going to go a little bit quicker, but feel free, just throw it right in the chat and hit enter. What are you noticing? A lot less blue to the right, a little bit more blank space. Mostly blue. We're on the east side of Rochester. Like a gridlock. A patch of color in Webster. Anyone see that by Phillips Road? Not gridlock. Okay. Here's a little bit more. Keep putting it in the chat. What do you notice and wonder? Any other patterns? Anything sticking out to you? I'm still seeing a lot of blue. Feel free to jot down maybe an inference. What do you think the dots might represent? Any other patterns that we're seeing? Are they people? Demographics? Home ownership versus rental maybe? Income? A lot of white space, a little bit of green space, not much. All right, take a deep breath. Here's the last part, still no key. What other patterns do you notice? I want you to look for barriers in this image. And also, what else might these dots be? Maybe ethnicities. I want to draw your attention to the inner and the outer loop in this image. Maybe this is income. When I do this in fourth grade, the kids get really excited about the airplane. I don't know if anyone saw that or is excited and afraid to admit it, but it's there. It's very cool. Notice the Genesee River here. And I want to point out we have orange, we have red, we've got green, and we've got a lot of blue, right? Notice 19th Ward to Gates, really kind of stark contrast often comes up. A lot of red by U of R. I'm going to give you the color. I'm going to give you the key, but I'm not going to give you the date. And I'm going to ask you to be brave. And I want you to jot down, what do you think the date is? Just throw it right in the chat. What year do you think this is? If one blue dot represents a white person, one green represents a Black person, one red represents one Asian person, one orange represents one Hispanic person. What year do you think this is? We got 22. Now, okay, what else? Any other guesses? 2000, 2010. All right, we're going all over. Not too far, though. We're staying in the last 20 years. It is amazing different groups we're a part of, the different ideas that people have. I've got 1900, 1960. I've heard 1980, all across the board. 1970, okay. So I'm going to give you the big reveal. We'll see who has bragging rights and who feels shame for not knowing. This is 2010. So this is the census for 2010, right? And I want to invite you to kind of think about this question. What story does this tell you about Rochester in 2010? What questions does it raise? Feel free to throw that in the chat. What story does this tell you about our community? What questions does it raise? What ahas is this giving you as you look? Someone sharing that they feel a little shocked as they see this image. You know, I felt that the first time. Someone sharing in the chat that their inference is segregation. That comes up for a lot of folks. Often I hear folks say people like to live by people who look like them. What barriers are there? What's choice? You know, notice how the river separates U of R from all the green dots over here, right? Less diversity in the outer areas. I want to notice the roads too. Like I've heard them described as like a wall or a moat, a separating line. You'll see the railroad right here separating my neighborhood. I live in Beechwood from East Avenue and Park Avenue. Tina wondering, you know, how does this connect to transportation? I think all of this is super, super important to think about. Here's the map from 2020. They don't have a 1 dot per person map. This one's 1 dot for 150, so it's not quite as interesting to me, but it's about the same. Greece has changed maybe a little bit over the last 10 years, but otherwise, not too much change. If you look back to 1940, our census data, notice the Black population was almost entirely in Rochester's 3rd and 7th wards. Same with the Puerto Rican. Notice 1950, about the same, 1960, and 1970. And I saw some of this in the chat, and I know a lot of you were thinking, why? What caused this? What might be behind some of what we're seeing in these images? And what did people do about it? How is it that in Greater Rochester, we have the single most segregated school district border in the country? Penfield and Rochester schools dividing line is the most segregating school district border by race and class as of 2020. How is it that home ownership is more than double in our white community than our Black and Hispanic? How do we have such incredible gaps in child poverty where almost 1 in 2 Black children are living in poverty, 40% of Hispanic, and yet only 13% of white? I mean, some of these gaps we're seeing are significant. Why is it that in our community, Black people are dying earlier, regardless of socioeconomic status across the board? What's going on? You know, our friends at ACT Rochester and Common Ground Health have pulled together tons of data like these that, you know, you're expected to live almost 9 years longer if you're born in Pittsburgh than if you're born in the inner city of Rochester. How did we get here? What caused some of this? What's happening when it comes to home ownership data, across our state? And I think some of it is that we haven't paused to really look at this, to ask that why question. And something I needed to really do is just recognize how I was feeling and sit with it and find the people like this group today to dive in and have the courage to know how we're feeling about it. For me, I feel a little sad. I feel a little angry. I feel a little thankful to know some of this, but I needed to kind of hold some of that in order to move forward. Like I said, I was a 4th grade teacher, so we do feelings. But I want to be honest. I feel like it matters that when we look at some of this stuff, that we take that moment to be human, as silly as these colors look, to take that moment to be human and say, here's how I'm feeling. I'm going to hold that. I'm not going to ignore it. And I'm going to find my people to dive in with what we're doing. James Baldwin says the purpose of education is to create in a person the ability to look at the world from himself and to make his own decisions. And that's what we're going to try to do now as we keep diving into this question. How has racism impacted Rochester? What does that have to do with these graphs and maps? How have people responded? How have people resisted? How have people found community and joy in the midst of oppression? And how does this history inform our equity journeys today? This equity journey goes back all the way to the 1800s, where people took all different kinds of actions. And I want to offer some language to help you kind of think about some of the sources we're going to look at in a minute. And in doing so, give you just a really quick history lesson too. So the first term I want to offer is anti-racist. We think of this as an adjective. We're not saying Frederick Douglass is an anti-racist, although you can draw that conclusion on your own. But I would say in many points of his life, Douglass, Anna Douglass, and his friends, like here at the Casanova Convention, they took actions, like with this convention, that showed that they were taking an action to actively fight against racism, acting and believing that racial groups were equals, right? Taking an action for equality. Or Daniel Penfield and Nathaniel Rochester, they took actions against equality. They were believing and acting as if one racial group was superior. Nathaniel Rochester and Daniel Penfield both brought enslaved African people with them to this region of New York State and forced them to work for no pay. I don't know who they were later in their lives. I don't know if they changed, but in these moments, I think you could argue that they were believing and acting as if one racial group was superior. And they could do this. And I think this is the key. It's bigger than just individuals. They could enslave in Rochester because of policy. In New York State, it was legal and voted upon that slavery could exist. In 1702, in New York, the Assembly passed a law that kept slavery legal, banned enslaved people from meeting in up to groups of 3, and said enslavers could punish enslaved people as they saw fit. These laws got updated all the way until 1827, when enslavement ended in New York State. And these things continue. Racism evolves. Another example of a racist policy might be the United Way, not funding Black-led organizations until the late 60s, or when they were called the Community Chest, or withholding funds from groups that supported the civil rights organization Fight, right? So, you see that we have this legacy, and this organization changed. I think it really matters that we see that, which is different from, again, racist, where you take an action against equality. George Eastman, when he supported the American Eugenics Society with his funding or refused to hire Black people in his factories, I would argue demonstrated actions that were racist. Notice I'm not calling him a racist. I think that's really important when we have some of these conversations. Also in our community, people have always taken actions for equality, like Howard Coles and Harper Sibley, who are part of the NAACP. They helped start the Frederick Douglass Voice newspaper, where they actually called out housing discrimination. They called out funding discrimination in the community, and they worked for housing justice. Again, taking actions in those moments to create equality. So now that we have a little bit of a look at what's going on today in Rochester, a little bit of language to help us think about some of the sources we're going to look at going forward, and a little bit of extra context, let's really dive in to take a peek at this. How did the root causes of some of this segregation come about? So let's start with 1910 to 1970. It's a period called the Great Migration. About 6 million African Americans moved from the South to northern cities like Rochester. Rochester went from only 5,000 African Americans in 1910 to about 30,000 in 1970. Really small numbers of Puerto Ricans in 1920s and 30s. But by the 60s and 70s, you see this second migration from Puerto Rico because of things like Operation Bootstrap, which was a pretty racist policy that kind of pushed people out. And all of a sudden, you have thousands of people coming to Rochester from Puerto Rico and thousands of Black folks coming from the South, especially from an area outside Orlando called Stanford. And many of these folks, when they came, tried to work at places like Kodak or Bausch and Lomb, but they weren't allowed to because of the color of their skin. Instead, often found jobs in factories or picking fruit in Rochester's suburbs or rural areas. And when they went to buy or rent a house in a town like Webster, where I grew up, they were met with several barriers. And we're going to look at a few of those. The first barrier they were met with was the local real estate board. This is our real estate board in Rochester. This real estate board voted to approve the National Real Estate Code of Ethics, which made it against the rules for a realtor to show a home to a non-white person in a white neighborhood. Howard Coles became a realtor. He showed homes to Black people in Brighton, and this group of men pushed him out of Rochester's real estate board. And it didn't matter how much money you had. Like Dr. Cooper here and his son and his wife Helen in 1954, he says, we answered ads for 69 apartments. We were refused at all of them. He was the first PhD in chemistry from U of R who was Black. He had a high-paying upper-class job. His wife had a high-paying upper-class job, both people with high levels of degrees. And yet the only place they could live was in the redlined Beechwood neighborhood, subletting from a Black family. Now, Dr. Cooper, who's still alive, talked to him the other day. He said that he wanted us to make sure we showed this picture in this presentation. And you'll notice in this picture, he and his son are laughing. They're experiencing joy and family. Dr. Cooper says this picture matters because so often we take a people's story or a person's story and only mark it by the oppression that they experience. And this exact same year they experienced this discrimination, they chose to not let it define who they were. Dr. Cooper always says, I know my inherent humanity and self-worth as a person. And my wife and I chose to find joy with our kids, to take the anger we felt from the discrimination and to not let it define us, but help us get involved. And so the Coopers decided, let's get involved, starting at home, starting with their neighbors and then their friends, and then going to banks where they realized there was something much bigger going on than just this real estate board. The real estate board and bankers had lobbied nationally for a federal policy called the National Housing Act. And this policy had sweeping effects in the Rochester area and affected the Coopers and many others. It also affected my family, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But maps like this one were one piece of how this law was implemented. In 1935, Rochester's map was drawn. And I want to invite folks to take 30 seconds to take a look at this map. I'm going to kind of zoom in again. Just take a close look at some of these areas. The Highland Park area, notice Brighton, Pittsford. Notice what's green, what's blue, what's yellow. You'll see white. Right? So kind of keeping a piece, noticing some of that. Take a look at this piece here. I'm going to point out there's no highways. We did have the Erie Canal. Do folks see that here? Erie Canal. We've got Gates, 19th Ward, Cornhill or Clarissa Street, the Fruit Street neighborhoods like Orange Street, Jay and Lyle. Again, notice the colors. Notice how blue never touches red. You'll notice that as kind of a pattern as we go through this. You'll see the Genesee River. You'll see Joseph Avenue area, Beechwood, East Irondequoit over here, Maplewood, right? As we keep going. And then here's our key. And I want to invite folks at this moment. You've had a chance to look a little. Share some notices and wonders in the chat. What are you noticing as you look at this map? What are you noticing when you look at this key? What feelings might be coming up for you? Go ahead, feel free to put them right in the chat. But notice here, the key says map showing grades of security. Green meaning best, blue desirable, yellow definite declining, and red hazardous. So again, take a second. Someone sharing a ton of overlap with the previous map, despite being quite a bit sooner. What other things do people notice as they look at the map or the key? Someone noticing they live in a yellow neighborhood. The terms connotate a strong feeling of discrimination. I'm kind of wondering, well, maybe, is this about that? What's behind some of these terms? It feels very subjective. I have a visceral reaction. My neighborhood was labeled hazardous, right? Like I don't feel that way about my neighborhood, but this is the government labeling my neighborhood this way. And so I want to invite us to take a peek. We have a documentary we don't have time to show you that goes in depth into some of this story. I'll share it with folks at the end, or you can find it on our website, which we'll also share. But what I want to do now is actually read to you some of the law that made this map. and it determined what was hazardous and what was best. And you'll notice the map doesn't cover rural areas, but this language in the law did. In order to get an FHA loan, you had to meet these requirements. The government between the 30s and 60s gave out they gave out $119 billion in mortgage insurance to 35 million families, including my own, following these guidelines. And as I read the guidelines in the law, I want you, as you see them, to jot down any word, phrase, or feeling that really comes up or sticks out to you, okay? And I expect to have like a ton of them in the chat. Any word, phrase, or feeling that sticks out. And notice what's different for different people. So this is the law that included the rules about what made a neighborhood a good and worthy investment for home ownership. Prediction may be made regarding the possibility of a location being invaded by such groups. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it's necessary that properties continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability or a reduction in value. Go ahead, throw it in the chat. What words are sticking out? I see invaded. What else? Reduction, value. Keep them coming as I go. Natural or artificially established barriers will prove effective in protecting a neighborhood and locations within from adverse influence, including the prevention of the infiltration of business and industrial use, lower class occupancy, and inharmonious racial groups. A high-speed traffic artery, a wide street parkway may prevent the expansion of inharmonious uses to a location on the opposite side of the street. Keep sharing words or phrases from the law that stick out to you. To be most effective, deed restrictions should be imposed on all land in the immediate environment of a subject location, with recommended restrictions that should be imposed upon all land in the immediate environment of a subject location, including the prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they are intended. And lastly, quality and accessibility of schools. The social class of parents of children in a school will in many instances have direct bearing. Thus, physical surroundings of a neighborhood may be favorable and conducive to enjoyable, pleasant living. However, if children of people living in an area are compelled to attend school where a majority or a considerable number of pupils represents a far lower level of society or incompatible racial element, the neighborhood under consideration will prove far less stable and desirable than if this condition did not exist. Take a look at what people wrote in the chat. Incompatible, lower level, intended, barriers, intentional. Why a place like Black Wall Street was hemmed in Tulsa, or Clarissa Street right here in Rochester. So some really important pieces. What do folks notice about the people who made this law? Notice some patterns about the authors. I want to point out that the authors and the signer, the president, was from New York State. I was often taught, this is just a Southern problem, right? Some of those things sticking out. Of course, no women. Women couldn't get a mortgage without their husband until 1974, black or white, nor could they get a credit card, right? I remember Black men and women couldn't vote in half of the country at this period of time when this law is getting passed. And so this law hired local real estate agents. It led to their hiring to go around and rate each neighborhood to help determine what it would be and who would get investment and who wouldn't. The Clarissa Street Cornhill neighborhood was 10% foreign or Italian and 75% Black. Both were seen as less than a full citizens, right? Pittsford, 0% foreign, businessmen, and 0% Black. Notice Black people got their own category on these areas. Notice in the Joseph Avenue area, 40% foreign, Italian, and Jewish. So Italians, Jewish folks, Hispanic people, people from Eastern European countries would often also experience redlining, being forced to live in some of these red neighborhoods, as well as always Black and brown folks. But people who are Italian or Jewish actually, while facing a lot of discrimination, the GI Bill in 1944 legally made these people white in the eyes of the government in terms of the GI Bill. So they actually could get a mortgage from the government and move to Brighton and move to Irondequoit, which is why you start to see a population shift, because those folks could assimilate. whereas Black folks couldn't do that until after 1968. You can see this in other areas, how Native Americans were discriminated against, like in Syracuse, the Nedrow area. They made it hazardous because it was being infiltrated by half-breeds, they described it as. So you can see the layers of what this is going. And yet, here's the thing. You see how the government and real estate agents describe these neighborhoods, but the people who lived in these neighborhoods didn't describe these neighborhoods in this way. They described some of the discrimination they experienced, but they also described the safety they felt from their neighbors. They described the community, the parades, like this Elks Parade you can see here on Clarissa Street. People of color in these neighborhoods described it as we had everything we needed. We had Black-owned businesses, hotels like the Hotel Gibson, Valets, Dan's. You had the Pithod Club. You had jazz, community, music. Joan Coles describes, getting in trouble down Clarissa Street, and then 3 times as she went back to her house, mothers coming out on the porch to tell her what she did wrong until she really got it when she got home. I mean, there was community in the midst of what was going on. And I think this is really important to recognize, that people saw these neighborhoods so much differently than how they're labeled. And yet some of those labels we still see in our community. And I really encourage you to dig into the clarissauprooted.org website. There is some powerful, powerful stories of these neighborhoods that you're going to want to see. Puerto Rican students like Roberto and Nydia and Nancy Padilla, Roberto Burgos, they called out this redlining. They described loving their communities, but not loving that the garbage trucks weren't coming because the city only did garbage service on consistent basis in the white neighborhoods like the Browncroft or Winton area. And so they called this out. They protested, they marched, they did sit-ins. And so it brings us to a place like this, right, where you start to see some gaps in our community, a connection from the past to the present. In 2022, the governor actually put out a report saying redlining is continuing in cities like Rochester, where 23.9% of the population is non-white of the people who are getting lending. And we're not seeing it in those previously redlined areas. We see higher temperatures, less tree cover, higher rates of food insecurity, of asthma, of lack of insurance, high blood pressure rates, mental health issues, violence. When we see a taking away of resources and a concentration of people without the things that we need in a community, we start to see some trouble and some connections to what happened in the past. And we have this in almost every single community across New York State. You can go online and dig into all of these maps, look at the neighborhoods, and really wrestle with what's going on. So before we look at what Dr. Cooper and his friends did next and started to challenge redlining and some of the other issues going on in the community, I just want to take a pause. I know in 30 minutes, we've shared a lot of history. I feel very overwhelmed when I read some of that language or see some of those maps. I want to take a pause, and I just want to invite folks in the chat, if you would, just share how you're feeling right now. Because for Dr. Cooper, what he always says to kids when he goes into his school at school number 10, he says, I knew how I was feeling. I was angry, but I was also proud of who I was. I was in that red zone and that green zone. And I said to myself, never give up. You're either involved or you're not. There's no middle ground, and I choose to be involved. So I want you to just take a second. Feel free to jot that into the chat. What feelings are coming up for you right now? How are you feeling? What's happening? And how you doing? How folks feeling? And if you don't feel comfortable sharing, just check in for yourself as well. And I appreciate in the chat, Norma sharing. The chat isn't meant to be a debate about politics or the presentation. I do hope to have questions at the end, but instead, let's use the chat if we can for some of the notices and wonders or sharings about what's coming up for folks. All right, so hold on to what you're feeling and what you're thinking, and let's dive in. So Dr. Cooper gets upset, right? But he recognizes the pride he has in himself. He and Helen decide we're going to go to some banks. They go to Rochester Savings Bank. They're denied because of the color of their skin. They go to Lincoln Alliance. They're denied because of the color of their skin. Central Trust, First Federal, almost every bank in town. And they realize we're missing something. We can't just do this on their own. So they get involved with the NAACP. They find Black, white, Puerto Rican allies, and they start working together. They are able to get a loan from Eastman Savings and Loan in 1958. They find a white realtor who's part of the NAACP who breaks the code of ethics and sells them a home in East Henrietta. They move in, and by 1960, they and 11 of their friends have moved in, making Henrietta Rochester's most diverse suburb with just 11 individual people of color living in the town of Henrietta. I just love this picture of Dr. Cooper from About Time magazine and this quote. He says, "My most successful endeavor was to be born in a family that was not supposed to survive in America, and yet survive and maintain an element of creativity and definitely a sense of my own integrity as a human being." And that's what he tried to do in his community. And he and his friends did that. Like Dr. Alice Holloway Young, our first Black principal, she helped found Monroe Community College, part of the Lynx. I think she just turned 100. She moved into the Blue Line's 19th Ward that was 100% white. She broke the rules, but they made their way in. They found a white friend to sell them the home under the table. They snuck into the neighborhood, and the next morning they found the Ku Klux Klan on their steps, threatening them. It was terrifying, and yet the Youngs refused to leave. And Dr. Young has asked me that when I share her story, I mention there was one white family on the street that knew better. She thinks they all knew better, but one family that had the courage to join her on her porch and to help tell those hooded Klansmen from the neighborhood, get off of our lawn. We're here to stay. And that's all it took. They backed down. But Rochester does have a legacy of using terror to prevent integration, to prevent racial equity. You see this with the hooded Klansmen, and this is actually East Rochester. The next day, 20,000 of them in their hoods and robes marched down Main Street in Rochester, making it clear that Black, Catholic, and Jewish folks were not welcome in our community. We see a lot of instances of this, right? As a tool to kind of keep people out. But it wasn't just violence. It wasn't just the law. It wasn't just the real estate board. There was something called racially restrictive covenants that my students kept hearing about as we interviewed elders in our community. And so we wrote a letter to the county clerk. We partnered with Yale Law School and City Roots Land Trust and did a deep dive at the clerk's office and found over 10,000 homes that had whites only covenants on their deeds in Rochester. But just as interesting, the names of the people that actually put these whites only deeds on homes to purposefully keep non-white people out was astonishing. We found that the county legislature actually voted in 1941 to put this racist deed on hundreds of homes and land that the county owned. We found that they did this in conjunction with the Gates School Board, with local banks, that schools like school number 4 in Gates actually put this lot can never be used or occupied by anyone not Caucasian. You can see this in the North Winton neighborhood, the Catholic Church, the bishop actually putting these deeds on a church in East Irondequoit. Walter Weigand choosing to put this on his home in Irondequoit, the Kodak Realty Corporation in Meadowbrook, the head of the Builders Association, the head of the Bar Association. I know I'm going overkill here, but what I want to get across is this point. Leaders of our community, highly educated people, made the decision to build Rochester the way it is. And yet others always made the choice against them, like Reuben Davis, our second Black lawyer, first Black judge. In 1958, he and his wife tried to buy a home in the 19th Ward, but Nothnagel Realty wouldn't sell it to them because there was a deed that said Black and Italians couldn't live in this neighborhood. You can see the advertisement for the house. But he was part of the NAACP. He found an ally to buy him the home, sell it to him under the table, and they made their way in and refused to back down and leave. We see issues like this happening in all of our schools, where like Honeyway Falls in 1960, the kids and teachers dressed up in blackface, Bloomfield, RCSD, Kodak, Newark, Aquinas, every school district in the area performed blackface shows as part of the explicitly racist curriculum to teach kids who was in, who was good, and who was out. But people always stood up, like Reverend Primo, whose kids faced these shows after he faced move-in violence and integrated the town of East Irondequoit. His kids went to these shows at their school, and he started a campaign with the NAACP, calling these shows out in the paper, sending letters to these schools, and eventually getting schools to stop performing these blackface shows by 1968. Now, in these red line spaces, there was joy, there was community, there was safety, and yet the buildings were old. They were falling down. There was an investment. It was hard to get a bank loan to improve the neighborhood. And instead of fixing this up, cities accessed something called urban renewal. And they used government funds to put highways right through a number of these neighborhoods. The Red Line 7th and 3rd wards each had over 800 families displaced from their homes to make way for the inner loop and other urban renewal projects that went into these areas. And, and after that many people get pushed out of their home, they're not allowed to move anywhere else but these Red Line neighborhoods. The overcrowding that resulted led to an uprising in 1964. 3 days of protests, 350 injured, 4 deaths, 800 arrests, over 1 million in property damage. People saying, hey, we have had enough. Almost every city in the country had an uprising like this in the 1960s in their Red Line neighborhoods, along with peaceful protests like this one against police violence for Rufus Fairwell, who was beaten for locking up the gas station that he managed on Plymouth and Columbia, and the leaders of the AME Zion Church on the steps of City Hall calling for justice for the Fairwells, or people like Mildred Johnson, who helped found the Public Defender's Office in Rochester, helped organize a group called Fight that challenged Kodak's discriminatory hiring policies, or Puerto Rican students who fought for bilingual educations with protests, parades, and even a sit-in with 500 people at the Rochester City School District's district office saying, we deserve bilingual education and teachers who can speak Spanish, changing the shape of the area. Or people like Maddie Best, who was a worker at U of R, someone who cleaned the labs, but was being underpaid, didn't have adequate health care or pension. And because of her skin color, the U of R did not allow Black women to perform patient-facing secretarial roles. So in 1973, she and over 800 of her friends organized 1199 Union, and they did a sit-in in Strong Hospital Alan Anderson's office and helped win the first ever anti-discrimination clause in a contract at the U of R, the first big anti-racist moment in the university's moment. Or a group like Fight, who organized and built housing, but couldn't build housing in the suburbs because as redlining becomes illegal in 1968, as racial covenants can no longer be enforced, suburbs in Rochester and across the country followed a new discriminatory playbook called exclusionary zoning. You realize we can't discriminate based on race, but we can discriminate based on class. So most all suburbs changed their loose zoning codes to make it illegal to build duplexes, multifamily homes, apartments, even accessory dwelling units on houses. People like Robert Rhodes at the NAACP, who integrated Pittsford, and his friend Joe Wilson, president of Xerox, actually worked together on a huge campaign with 300 pastors from the area, white and Black, who called out the zoning in Penfield and Pittsford as the new Jim Crow, as the new racial covenants, that it would lead to an apartheid-like community. And these zoning codes passed. The civil rights leaders lost in these moments, and the zoning codes from the 60s are the exact same zoning codes that we have today in almost all of our suburban towns. And yet people are challenging this. A Democrat and Republican-led group called the Raise Commission actually wrote down the recommendation that we need to relook at our zoning codes to get creative about how we increase affordability in housing and diversity across our community in really thoughtful and well-planned ways to allow different areas of access. A student named Benita Corrala learned about this history on our website, resistancemapping.org, and she realized, I want to be a part of changing this. She had been a refugee from Nepal. Her family had had trouble finding housing. Henrietta has some of the better zoning code, and they were actually able to move into the town, and it made a huge difference for her and her family. And so she went with 20 of her friends, and they spoke to the town board about the new apartments by the U of R at Marketplace Mall that were only going to allow elderly people. And they pushed to have that change to allow families like hers to have that opportunity and access. And I could go on with story after story, of past to present, of people from all different backgrounds coming together, saying, like Dr. Cooper, I respect my inherent dignity as a human being and that of my neighbor, and I'm going to work to build a more just and equitable Greater Rochester community. And so it's my hope today that we've gotten a little bit closer to answering these questions. How has racism impacted Greater Rochester? How have people responded? How have they resisted? What about how people have resisted is something that I might do, right? Dr. Cooper says, never give up. Either involved or you're not. There's not a middle ground. I choose to be involved. I want you to think about that, right? You had Dr. Cooper with his friends, physically moving, going to meetings, organizing. You had Mildred Johnson helping protest, sing songs. At protest, she actually helped build the public defender's office. You have people like Alice Young, who partnered with people to help her buy a home. She stood up to violence in the Ku Klux Klan. You have other people like the Bushes, who knew what the right thing was to do, and they had the courage to join the Youngs and be that friend that just stood on their porch. And what I want to ask each of you is, who is someone that you learned about today that inspires you to get involved, to never give up? And who's someone who did a strategy in our community that you could see yourself doing, whether it's going to a meeting, whether it's participating in local politics, whether it's supporting something like speaking at a town board meeting, whether it's physically standing with someone in the face of discrimination or standing up and speaking out. Who is the person that you learned about today that you don't want to forget about? And I want you to think about, how does this history inform our equity journey together? So feel free to share in the chat the name of someone you learned about today, or one of the stories that you don't want to forget that inspires you to get involved, to not give up, to be a part of carrying on this legacy that brings us forward. And as you're doing that, I want to notice this photograph of Dr. Walter Cooper and Dr. William Jacob Knox. Dr. Cooper, whenever we talk, almost always mentions Dr. Knox. Dr. Knox was one of the leaders of the NAACP. He was a scientist on the Manhattan Project. Folks saw Oppenheimer this year. He was a part of that. He came to Rochester, and he was a mentor to Dr. Cooper. He helped him get involved. He supported him when he fell down or didn't know what to do. And Dr. Cooper always talks about that. Who are the people you're going to go with? Who are the people that will be your allies? Who are the people that will be your mentors, as a key part of how the change in our community happens? So again, I want to say thanks for having me. I want to invite you to share in the chat someone that is going to inspire you to move forward and carry on this journey. If you want to learn more about our project, this history, and our work, over 100 different stories can be accessed for free, as well as lessons, resources, our documentary on our website, resistancemapping.org. You can scan the QR code, or you can go there. We partnered with professors at the U of R and the RIT to build an incredible interactive database of civil rights history in Rochester for schools and our community. And I hope you enjoy. So I want to say thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Norma to facilitate any discussion or questions that might come up. But have an awesome rest of your day, folks, and we'll hang out and answer some questions. So again, feel free in the chat if you have a question. Feel free to drop that in the chat. I don't know, Norma, if you have anything you want to add here for this last piece.
Shane, thank you so very much for giving us this history lesson. And when I look at, the chat, and I think about, who has made the biggest impression on me, or who, when I walk away from this presentation, will I remember, I have to say there were wonderful faces of people that I know, that I grew up knowing. And so I'm so grateful to have grown up in a city where I got to know some of these change agents and these people who worked really hard to make change. I know, maybe I can kick off the question if that's okay. And maybe if
Please.
you rephrase the question, because I want to make sure I'm answering exactly what you asked me, so that I'm not going off on a tangent and ruining your presentation.
Go away. You can't. It's
Just to say,
impossible.
I have so much to say, and I appreciate. I guess I wish that this was required learning for all students in Rochester. As a journalist for 23 years, I would have benefited greatly from this presentation 25, 26 years ago when I started reporting, to really understand our city. And so for those of you who are watching, this presentation is being recorded, so it will be available for you later. But let's open up. Is it okay now if we open up to some other questions?
Please.
Our audience? All right, thank you. So let's start putting in some questions in the chat, if you don't mind, and I will call on you to, and I'll ask them, or if you have a comment, a question, and let me be very clear. I know, because I've been watching chat, Shane, these presentations bring up a lot of feelings in people.
Oh,
and so some of it, some of it can be, for you as a presenter, how do you take some of the questions if or maybe some of the challenges or the pushback that you might get from people when they're presented with historical documents and facts and things like that?
So how do I deal with challenges or pushback to some of the history?
Yes.
We see this some of the time, right? What we try to do first is we do try to root things in primary source documents and history. We try to acknowledge that from the beginning, this is only an hour. We usually do this presentation in 3 hours with handouts and real interactive. This is just a peek at some of the story, right? We're not saying that we've got the whole story or we've got the truth of everything that happened. But this is a piece of the story that certainly hasn't been taught, right? And that is an important part of the story. And I think for us saying, I often say to people, what are you afraid of with acknowledging that racial covenants happened? Because it's on the deed, it's at the clerk's office. What are you afraid of acknowledging that 35 million white families like mine had access to home ownership when the majority of Black and Brown folks did not? My family moved to Greece in 1950. My grandpa got an FHA loan. He couldn't have bought his house without that government mortgage. It allowed him to build wealth. It allowed him to build equity and invest in his business. He sent my mom and he sent me to college with some of the wealth from that home, right? We weren't rich, but that made a difference. And when Keisha and I do this presentation together, she talks about her grandfather who was Black. He lived in the redlined, Joseph Avenue area. He couldn't buy a house until 1970. Keisha took out loans for her college. My college was paid for because of family generational wealth, right? And I can't I can't I can't say how uncomfortable at first it made me feel when I realized I had benefited from something. And yet it wasn't my choice. I didn't do this, but it is a part of my story. And if I can love my family and myself and love my community, I feel like I need to tell the truth about it and to know who I am. Like it makes me a stronger person to know this and to realize that when I see some of the divides in our community, it stems from some of this. This isn't the only place. There's lots of pieces that are part of this puzzle, but this is one piece that I never learned about growing up. In church growing up, I learned this was because people, they weren't religious enough. They didn't try hard enough. They didn't, you know, X or the other. What I didn't learn is I got an unfair advantage that a whole group of people in our community did not. And that's a huge part of the story that I needed to know.
Shane, some people might hear, and again, you reconciled with, the reality or facing your own privilege. And still today, people are still very uncomfortable when discussing these topics because, no one wants to be made to feel uncomfortable. We shy away from uncomfortable and difficult conversations. What advice do you have for us here on the call today for how to engage in difficult and uncomfortable conversations so that they are still productive? Because it's very easy to see conversations devolve into name calling or to finger pointing. What advice do you have for us today as we confront our own privileges, as we confront our own realities, and indeed our own history, right? Because this is also a self journey. There's a lot of self unpacking that goes on when engaging in this work, right?
I think to me, it's like how are we entering into those conversations? When I found myself getting into a conversation where I'm realizing, oh, we've got some very different views. I like to take a pause and be like, hold on, like I can tell big feelings are coming up in this conversation. Can we pause and just kind of talk about how we want to have this conversation? Because I don't want this to be feeling like a Sunday night dinner in 2016 at my family's house where we were shouting. It wasn't good. Instead, I would really like to understand where you're coming from. And we often use a couple group norms, just simply like, can we use I statements when we share an opinion? Like, can we, assume good intentions of each other, but also feel like we can own our impact if what we say causes offense? Like, just some of those simple moves. Can we accept non-closure? Like, just a couple of those things before we have the conversation has made such a huge difference. Having these conversations with primary source documents or a text in front of you instead of just I heard or random anecdote or this news story from I can't remember where. I don't find that productive. Like let's start from some shared ideas, some shared understanding. Let's understand where we disagree and make space for each other. And in those moments when people do cause harm or say something that feels offensive, not attacking, but saying something like using an I statement. I feel uncomfortable with what you just said. That bothers me. Instead of you're a bad person. See the difference? Like you're a bad person for thinking that or saying that or having an idea that seems ignorant. No, no, no. Help me understand why you said that. Tell me more. Like, can I share with you some of what I've been learning about that? Or one I've used a lot. I actually used to think that too, but I've started to think this. What do you think about that? Instead of you're bad. Like that's where it devolves. Instead of no, no, we're part of this community together. Can't we build something in this way?
Civil discourse is something we're trying to model and teach our students at the university level. And it's a very important thing. We haven't all been educated on how to have these difficult conversations or how to disagree with one another, yet still remember each other's humanity. I think that's the hard part. Just like you said,
Huge.
I may not like what you say, but I still like you, right? And I still respect you and I respect your humanity and I respect your right to say how you feel. And so I know that, that is something that we're taking up. I put in chat, if that's okay, to folks
Yeah.
who are interested in learning more about our initiative at the university called Live the 6 words: stop hate, end racism, choose love, inspired by the horrific um, shooting at the Top supermarket in May of 22, where 10 Black people were killed and targeted by a white supremacist. It was a horrific moment in our history. And we're trying to, as the Buffalo Bills did through their Choose Love campaign, to bring attention to efforts to respect one another, respect each other's humanity. So go there for more information. But we have about 4 minutes left, and I want to make sure we use every single one of these moments to ask Shane any questions you may have. One of the questions in the chat was, do you make these presentations to other places and spaces? And the answer is unequivocally yes, right?
Absolutely. So Keisha and I, all over town, to school boards, to classrooms, to the universities, all the universities, nonprofits, law firms, construction companies, labor unions. We've gone, I think, in the last 2 years, have presented to at least 250 different groups. Like all the time, we love to come out. This is our mission. We have generous community support from local funders to help tell these stories and tailor a space and experience around some of this history for your organization or group. And you can reach out through resistancemapping.org, or you can always email me at sweigand@ccsi.org. We would love to work with you. We have our short film with Carvin Eisen that we do some really great screenings and interactive discussions if a video is better than a lecture for you. But there's all kinds of ways that you can engage with us, and we would absolutely love to come. And I'll put that film in the chat if you'd like to see it. It is on our website.
A couple questions really quickly here.
Yep.
Uh, 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 Karen Gallen asks, what are the ways that individuals and groups can best partner with the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project? I think you answered that. Email Shane, Karen, and let them know that you're interested in partnering and learning more. One of the questions is about how caregivers, physicians can best advocate for the families that we care for, which I think, is another really big question. If you have an answer to that briefly, for those who are really dealing with, these are physicians who see their patients and want to give the best care. But once they leave their care, physical care, they want to do more to help them. How can they advocate for them?
To me, individually, by speaking up and standing up, listening and believing people when they tell you about their experience, and then asking the next question, what system is making this happen more consistently in these communities, right? In our organization. Why is it that translation services, especially for Spanish speakers, still we keep hearing it's not good enough? Are you using your incredible power and privilege, especially as a physician, to speak up? Are you looking at how are people not going bankrupt for using the services at U of R and truly have real access to good medical care when they come in? From each part of the experience, are you holding someone accountable when you see a fellow doctor or nurse or whoever speak to someone in a way that is not respectful? Like, we know this happens. Like, are you saying something? Are you going to get some training to support inviting someone into doing better instead of shaming them and calling them out. Let's take those steps, but then let's also figure out what allows those folks that continue to do that to do it. What are some of those systems? To me, there's a lot we need to look at. How are we making this a safer and more welcoming place for physicians of color? Right now, there's very low numbers of physicians of color in our medical school, and what are we doing to make it a safer place? The culture needs to grow and change. I know, Norma, you guys are working on this stuff at U of R, but it's going to take people speaking up
Yes.
in each department and each space to break out of their silo and get on board with that work.
I know you know that so well after having worked with some folks in departments at the university
Yeah.
medical center. But yeah, policy begins at the change, or policy begins, or change rather begins at the policy level. So, it really is very important that we look at those policies that have kept us back and held us back. Thank you so much, Shane, for your incredible presentation today. I know you've got, we were talking before we began, a children's book down the line. You've got a lot of things happening. What's the next iteration of the work that you're doing, and where can we find you outside of this presentation today? And then I'll let everybody go to their next thing. I know that everybody's hopping off real quick.
I don't know. You could find us at resistancemapping.org and dig into the resources and
The link?
reach out to us, and would love to talk more. And we'll be out and about every day next week, somewhere in the community doing a presentation. So excited. Thanks for having me, Norma.
So much. And again, folks, sign up for the 21-day equity challenge at urmccelebrates.com. And then join us for 2 amazing conversations next week and the week after. When you go to the website, you can sign up there, and I'll be sharing more information with all of you. We've got 2 great speakers talking about mitigating burnout in this work that we do, as well as how to create a culture of belonging where you are. And so all of that is wonderful information that you can take wherever you go. Thank you so very much. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye. Thanks, Shane.